Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's session on BIC Hybrid, where we bring to you programs that are both online and in BIC's physical space. Food and Faith, a pilgrim's journey through India. Joining us today is Shobha Narayan, who will approach the question of faith through its most primal and nourishing aspect. Sri Lakshmi Gururaja, who will be in conversation with Shobha. For those of you who are joining us online, do post your questions in the Q&A box. We will be sharing the bios of both today's speakers in the chat box. With that, over to you, Shobha.
Thank you, Raghu. Food and Faith began in 2015 when I began exploring my relationship with my faith, which happens to be Hinduism. I think there comes a point in everyone's life where you have to figure out whether you are a devout person, a seeker, or a skeptic, or an atheist. Now, I began this journey as a skeptic, and I decided that I would approach faith through, like Raghu said, through food. I would visit a variety of shrines across India. I would taste the prasadams, or prasad as they call it in North India. And if nothing else, I would eat well and figure out how to make my peace with God. We start our journey at the closest temple that I went to, which is the Udupi temple, Sri Krishna temple. It is part of our religious beat because my mother is a worshipper of Kollur Mookambika. So I have visited this temple for about 30 years. And on January 18th, just a few weeks ago, the Bale Muhurta was performed in Udupi to prepare for a biannual event called the Paryaya. What is a Paryaya? Paryaya is a transfer of power. The 13th century philosopher Madhvacharya, who established Udupi, decided that leadership would be shared between Ashtamatas, and once every 2 years, the matas would transfer the power. And this brings the first question that I went to Udupi with, which is, what is the purpose of rituals? And one answer that Udupi gives resoundingly is that the purpose of rituals, the purpose of tradition, is preservation, not just of sacred tenets, but even very earthy things. For example, they have 4 things they do before the Paryaya, and one is called the Akki Muhurta, in which rice for the feeding of 15,000 people on pretty much on a daily basis is the rice saplings or the rice seeds are collected. And they collect local and indigenous varieties, like the names themselves are very beautiful, like Mullera, Padmareka, Gauri, Honnekattu. So there are about 18 murras of rice that the devout like these people carry and offer it first in the sanctum sanctorum and then take it out to the fields to be planted so that they can be harvested 2 years from now. And this is ongoing. So after the Bale Muhurta comes the Akki Muhurta, and then they have the Kattige Muhurta, which is for the wood. And this Kattige wood that is chopped, again, they plant tree saplings in exchange for these, and they arrange it in this beautiful fashion to be used again for the feeding of the god. And the last one before the Paryaya is the Batta or paddy. And you can see the people here carrying the paddy, taking it into the temple with the Matha Adhikaris before taking it out to the paddy fields for planting. So temple prasadams feed the faithful, but they also do more than that. I mean, they preserve rice, they preserve saplings, they preserve wood. Indigenous varieties of wood are used mostly in the temples. And then the last thing is the feeding of the faithful. And this is why in Udupi, the god is called Anna Brahma. And it is because on every day, the number ranges from 15,000 to 30,000. And when I went and sat for this prasadam, I had a lot of questions because there is a segregation which happens. The Brahmins eat in a separate place. and I had my doubts and questions about whether this was right. I refer to Geeta Rao's book in this chapter about the types of food that is prepared. There is a local brinjal called Mattu Gulla, and they use that. But this image really caught me, because you see this man, he must be 90 years old. And the 3 days I was there, he was there every day. And it lent him purpose and meaning in his life. And I talked to him later and I said, "Why are you here every day?" And he says, "My family has deserted me, but I live in the shadow of Krishna." So there are people, this photograph is about the local variety of pumpkin that is used. And you know, it is easy for us to dismiss this, but these men work, the priests I found work really hard. They work from 5 in the morning till 12 at midnight when they put the god to bed. And the cooks and the whole factory that goes behind the running of a temple, extremely hardworking. So this pumpkin, and then this is the rice that is fed every day, and they carry it out in baskets and feed them. And this is what I had. This was the rasa, the pumpkin goju, I think Sri would correct me, and the paisa and the anna. So it was delicious. It was simple. It was sattvic. I think there are commonalities in all temple cuisine. One is that they don't use foreign vegetables. They don't, paneer butter masala you will not get. They believe in vasanas, which is that the intention of the cook matters. So when you go to the cooking area, you will find them, not this tape on rewind all the time. They will be chanting Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. They believe that the intentions and the transcendence of the cooking person is fused into the food. So the good vasanas come in the food. And this is why I think we call it sattvic food, because it's become fashionable to say local, regional, seasonal, indigenous. It conforms to all of that. So this was Udupi. And from Udupi, let's go to Kashi. Actually, this is not Kashi. I went to Haridwar, the Kumbh Mela. This is Ganga near Haridwar, Rishikesh. The Kumbh Mela is a spectacle. And if you want to experience Hinduism in all its fervor, it's a good place to start. And I met countless Naga Babas. This man, his name was Harji Puri. And I saw him sitting just by the banks of the Ganga. You can see it in the back. And he lives his life on chai and charas. Charas is like a hashish. You roll it up, you put it in a pot, and then there's a hole in the bottom and you smoke it. And that's his devotee. He sits every day. He says, we are here to save a religion, which for him means Hinduism. And an 8th century saint called Shankaracharya went there and established the akharas. There are 7 of them. There is the Juna, there is the Niranjani Akhara. He belongs to that akhara. And it's these are people who retreat to the Himalayas, and they come during the Kumbh Mela, much like Florence is a seat for Renaissance painters, and much like Socrates and Plato wandered around the streets of Greece talking, much like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs go to the valley to exchange ideas. These people retreat to the hills or the jungles, and then they come during the Kumbh Mela for a sharing of their ideas. And he said, I'm originally from Bihar. I became an orphan. My uncle ill-treated me, so I ran away and I joined the akhada. And the biggest akhada is the Juna akhada. And I visited it. They have a huge ashram there. And much perhaps like many of you, I have a very tenuous relationship with Godman. I begin with suspicion. And so he said, all you newspaper reading people, you have this idea that everything is from the head. Whereas we believers know that it also belongs to the heart. And for you to understand and to open your heart, you have to be in a place like Haridwar during the Kumbh. because then the arrogance of the cerebral world that you live in will slightly subside and you will be able to feel. And, you know, it sort of struck me because we talk about mind, body, and spirit. This gentleman is a South Indian, border of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. He has been visiting the Kumbh, not just in Haridwar, but also Ujjain, Nashik, and the Prayag every time it happens. And he said, I lost my child in a motor accident. How now to make sense of life? And he said this in English, he's a professor. How now to make sense of my life? Coming here, being near the Ganga gives my life meaning and purpose. So this is a theme that kept coming. So there are 3 or 4 words that came throughout. One is sense of meaning, sense of community, sense of purpose. You saw the community among the cooks who, you know, they do to work together, they laugh together. Sense of meaning when life gives you a monkey wrench and you don't know, you're unmoored, what do you do? So his idea was to seek faith. And the mind-body connection happened with Swami Avdeshananda, who has a huge ashram in Kankal with hangers on. There are gun-toting policemen behind him. There are rich people. I mean, it's sprawling. So a lot of money has gone in. And because I was a journalist, I was able to talk to him. And he is like a very good politician because he has the Naga Babas who will come with their entourage to ask him questions. One woman walked up and said, Swamiji, and with one intense said, Swamiji, I want to see Shiva. I mean, if somebody comes and asks you this, how do you respond? Because she was clearly sincere. So he is going from, let's feed the Naga Babas to how will I meet Shiva to is there enough dealing with a journalist in the middle? So much like a politician. But then, so I had dismissed him. I said, you know, this guy is a politician. And I had dismissed him. And then he said, excuse me, I have to go do my prayers. And this is what he does. So there's a Rudraksh tree that is supposedly 150 years old in the ashram. And he goes, and you're not seeing this in the photo, but there is milk and there's tulsi. And he goes and prays to the tree and hugs the tree and falls at its feet. So I come out and I don't even ask him anything. He says, when you touch the earth, how can you forget it? When you hug a tree, how can you cut down the trees? This is a bit of a stretch because they are cutting down for the firewood and all that, but they are planting as well. And when you use your senses, for example, when you throw tulsi, when you touch water, Gangajal or milk or something, you become in touch with all aspects of yourself. So I have not forgotten that because I think all rituals, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Hindu, all rituals are a very sensual process. They bring the cerebral into the spirit, and that is their purpose. So I liked what he said. And then of course there is the Kumbh, actual Kumbh, when it's a zoo, it's hardly anything that will elevate your spirits. People are jostling and everything. This is Kashi. Global surveys show, by the way, that China has the most number of atheists, 90% of its population, followed by Scandinavian countries, 60 to 75% population is atheist. The lowest atheist population is Nigeria, Ghana, you get the drift. But India and Thailand are anomalies. You can say poor countries can't afford to give up their grip on God, but India and Thailand are anomalies. Here, we have only 15% who are atheist. And I think that's because in India and Thailand, the arts, dance, Madhu is here, music, just look at how the aesthetic of arranging the flowers are all linked to faith. So our culture is linked to faith. So unlike China, which sort of deracinated itself with the Cultural Revolution, in India, we still have a link to a past that goes back 2,500, 4,000 years. So this next one is an Indian cliche. I actually witnessed it near the Assi Ghat, and I started talking to him afterwards. And he told me some very interesting things. He said, you know, my snake charmers go as far as Egypt. And I checked it, and he said it's true. And he said, we are healers and magicians. Only now we've become like circus actors. And India was the land of the snakes, and Prakrit was called the language of the snakes. So we had Baka, which comes from the Patal Lok, which is the underworld. We had Prakrit for our world, and we had Sanskrit, which is the language of the gods. So I went back and researched it. It is in fact true that most cultures have, so even if you go to Italy and all this Bulgari, you see there are snakes in the bracelet. So every old culture venerated snakes. And the beauty is that in India, we still continue to do so, because this Romanian scholar who I love called Mircea Eliade, he wrote a book called The Sacred and the Profane. And he said most cultures have given up their link between the profane, which is the mundane world, and the sacred world, whereas India has not. So you go to Greece and you don't see Zeus and all wandering around the earth. You go to Egypt, there is no Ra or Anubis or any of the gods. They had as spectacular a mythology as we did. Persia with the Sufi, but they have somehow decided that they will just cut off the past, and the enlightenment and the modernness will be a separate. Whereas here we live in India in a magical world, because myths are when the gods break the cloud and come into the world as avatars. And in India, you can still see that in Kashi. This man told me the power of belief is that the Ganga, everybody tells me, is impure, but I have a dip and I have not fallen sick. You can see me standing here. So there's this notion of pavitrata and there's Gandagi. The Ganga is impure, but she is still pavitra. So, and honestly, I think for all of us in this room, Ganga is something like what Nehru said, the river of India. She carries all our hopes and dreams. So then we go to Jagannath Puri, which is an amazing temple. This is the two Raths where Krishna, Subhadra and Balabhadra go to visit their aunt Gundecha during the Rath Yatra. And here too, I couldn't enter the temple's kitchens, it's not allowed. But this legend is that the Char Dham, Vishnu takes a bath in Rameshwaram, he comes to Puri to have his lunch, and so we serve him Chappan Bhog. Then he goes to Badrinath to meditate for the welfare of the humanity, and he falls asleep in Dwarka. So all four. And here, it's a tantric temple. It's an amazing temple, and my chapter talks about how the Shaktas, the Shaivites, the Vaishnavites, all lay claim, Buddhists and Jainas all lay claim to this temple. And this is goddess Bimla. And one of the Shaura cooks, the Shauras are tribals, they have a role, the Kshatriyas have a role, and the Brahmins have a role. So this man tells me, if I think even for one moment that I am cooking this god's prasads, my pots will shatter. I am merely a servant of goddess Bimla Devi or Mahalakshmi, who is Vishnu's consort. She cooks the food, and you can hear her anklets. Now, this is either a feat of imagination or transcendence. And today in California, people take cannabis to achieve that kind of transcendence. But time and time again, I met devotees who are able to go to visualize, perhaps because he's clearly sincere, he's saying, I hear her anklets, or they have achieved that transcendence that we all long for. What is ecstasy? Ecstasy is dance, the devotees that I see dancing as they enter the Puri temple or any temple. Ecstasy is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who any painting you look at him and his eyes are looking upwards and he is dancing. So the same recipe here, you see the same pumpkin that you saw in Udupi is here. And there are 9 pots in this. And 9 is a sacred number in Hinduism, as you know, Navarasa, Navagraha, Navaratna. So there are 9 pots stacked on top of each other, and a 9-shaped yantra is placed on the ground. You light the firewood, and the heavy pulses are in the bottom, then rice, then vegetables, and everything gets slow cooked, as we all say. And then it is segregated and given to the devotees. So this is actually Ananta Vasudeva temple in Bhubaneswar. In Puri, they're very strict. I couldn't even see, but this is how they cook. And on the left side is the Rath. And then every family takes their share, and they can go to the Ananda Bazaar market and sell it. Then we go to Ajmer. Ajmer is a Sufi shrine. It is where Khwaja Mohinuddin Chishti achieved oneness with God. This is the Kesaria bath, which is made with broken wheat, sugar, ghee, cashew nuts, and nuts, almonds too. And the devotees come with their mannat, and the feeling is this Ganga Jamuna Sanskriti, and you take your roses, you go into the sanctum sanctorum, which is here, and here too you will meet the hustling priests that we see in every Hindu temple who will say, you come with me, I will give you special darshan and everything. But then you come out and then you find these moments where people are achieving peace and a little bit of, not thinking about their daily lives. This was very touching to me because this is about the Bade Deg, which is feeding of some, again, 15,000 people is a number. But you see everybody's hopes and dreams. There are cradles, there are homes, there is money, there is painters' hands. And when everything is gone, you have to go to God, is what they said. When all is lost, you go to God. So from there, we come to Ayagar Kovil in South India. And this is where, this was very touching because the priest is doing Tirunir. And he allowed me, he said, I have no time for you. I said, I have to interview you. He said, okay, you come at 6 p.m. I'll be getting ready for the evening worship and you can talk to me.
Had taken secondly Simha to protect Dharma in our Bharat. All saints and Brahma, Devas, Shiva, Indra, 33 crores of Devas requested Lord Bhagavan to protect Dharma from Hiranyasara, from the dangerous event of Hiranyasara.
I was sort of like an intruder, a woman, getting like a male standing when a woman is getting dressed. It was the opposite. And this is the Ayagar Kovil Vadai, Dosai, which is the most tasty prasadam because they deep fry it in ghee and they make these Tirumal Vadai. I asked him, what is the origin of this? In Tirupati, they do Tirumal Vadai. In Ayagar Kovil, we call it Dosai and a little bit bigger. The one offered to God is about the size of this. It's like a tire. And then the one that's sold to devotees. And look at these women. They come here every day. They're smiling, they're laughing, they're doing their work. And then this is being sold to the devotees. So that was that. That was the transcendence Now this was in Nepal, in Patan. I went there to interview this Rinpoche, who is a Buddhist man, and he was making a film in Patan about Dakinis. And Madhu Chinnamasta was a big part of this. And what are Dakinis? Dakinis are fierce goddesses who will take you for a ride. And he told me, this Rinpoche, he said, one of the messages of my movie is that you do not become a slave to reason alone, because there are many things in the world that have no reason, that are magical. That is life. The moment reasoning creeps in, your life will become square, like Starbucks coffee. That's it. Then it will be franchised. Now, this man travels the world. There's a department in Stanford where he teaches. So he makes movies. He has followers. So he said the way to, I said, how do I reach this Dakini? He said, it's a left-handed path, which is that, and there's a Sanskrit word for that. So use your left side of your body more. Glance to the left, use your left hand. That's a good way to reach. So I've tried after that. This is Kumari, of course, in Nepal, and she has been chosen in Patan to be benevolent to her followers. And this is the guide who took me there, and he said, she's a young girl, buy her some Horlicks. So this is what we did. And then this was in the evening, men dressed in costume and gathered at the town square. And what are we offering? This is food. This was called Dasain, and this is Dashera. So this happened in Nepal. So in Nepal, I understood about the Dakini and that all women goddesses don't need to be sanitized like, what we have done with except for Kali and the yoginis. Our Lakshmi and Saraswati have been somewhat sanitized, whereas the Dakini is fierce. And to see the Dakini, what this Rinpoche said was, you go and give a gift to a woman or a man or even a dog, and you just say, you are the queen of my heart forever and ever. And I was thinking, I can't do that. But essentially what he was saying is that be open to people who can impact your life. When you walk on the street, don't go on the cell phone. Allow your intuition to flower. And when you have a connection with somebody, even a stranger, approach them, talk to them. This is what what you do, Sri. And so we have forgotten that. So essentially what he was saying was, in order for spirit to come into your life, you have to be open. This is Mathura. Of course, the pedas are very famous, and he's making them. And then this is Ambalapura, which actually is one of the most delicious temples. Palpayasam here is very delicious. And this man, what was touching is he's the chief cook. And they get the milk from the Goshala, and they stir, and it's 300 liters of 400 liters of milk and water, which get reduced to 90 liters over 5 hours, from 5 a.m. to 12 noon. So the taste comes from the urli, the taste comes from the wooden spoon that they've been using, the taste comes from the nyavara rice, which is local, the taste comes from the water and the reduction. And he goes out, and before offering, he goes out and stands near the tank, and he says, Vasudeva, and without a shade of self-consciousness. I am very self-conscious doing it here. So he is shouting. And the belief is this God will come at the appointed hour to partake of the prasadam. No, and that is devotion. I'm not there yet, but they do this every day. They call Sri Krishna, comes, has the prasadam, and then they give it to the devotees. Nearby is Kottarakara, whose unniyappams are very famous. Kottarakara is they make that with rice flour, coconut, and they use a banana called Palayan Todan, also local, and they feed. But look at how beautiful this is. This is the bronze thing that we all prostrate in front of. Aesthetics and religion in India certainly, and perhaps even in Tehran, are all linked. So the last thing I will say before I invite Sri is the Parni temple. This is an old god called Muruga. And here too, the power of faith I saw, because this woman is rolling around the temple and saying Muruganuka Haro Hara. And these men are climbing the hill and lighting camphor on every step. So I watch them and I think, what are they seeking? What have they lost? And why are they doing this? And why do they believe that this God will solve their problems? And why am I not able to believe that? And I think that's because I still live in the head. I still am rational. And we are lucky because in India, we still have the older generation who teach us that there's another way to live, which is living through the heart. But for most of us, we are taught to be rational. This guy, he says, I'm a Miras Pandaram. What does that mean? He says, I go at the end of the day and I read the accounts to God. I said, what do you mean? He says, I'll tell Muruga, today we got 50,000 rupees in donation. Today the cost of the bananas was so much. And the Panchamritam comes from country sugar, local, from the bananas, the Malaparam, which is grown in the hills, lots of them. But the sad part is now it's all mechanized. So the women don't touch the Panchamritam, unlike old where it was stirred by hand. And this is Jaipur, the Govind Devji temple. And look at this. And here too, the woman outside interested me because she sits there every day making flowers to sell for the god. And it gives her purpose, it gives her meaning, it gives her a sense of living in the shadow of the gods. She's perhaps a widow, she's perhaps been thrown out by her children, who knows. But I just saw, you know what, this Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he said flow experience, where you're lost. And I saw that in all this. When the shrine is open, they all put up their hands, which is something I've not seen in South India, but they do that. And then they sing to the Lord and they sway and stuff like that. So this is, and of course I have to end with Amritsar. Amritsar here where they are making coconuts, the langar of Amritsar, the religion that worships a book. I mean, how can one not like that? And here are the women who made the rotis, and I ended up sitting with them. I like foolishly a South Indian trying to keep up with Punjabi women making rotis. So there's that. And then these are the men. Again, I went and talked to the blue turbaned man, and I said, what are you doing here and why do you come here? And he turned around and said, why are you not here? Because what are you doing that is better than what I'm doing? And what do you want? And that sort of, shocked me. He said, In life, what do we want? We want community, we want connection, we want some sense of peacefulness. And he gets all that. He gets the sense of volunteerism. And look at this is how many people are fed every day. And the place is very humble. People sit on the floor as I did, and we eat sattvic but good food. And I want to end by showing some 5 photos, which to me define what transcendence is, which is the moment when you forget yourself. And you can achieve this transcendence when you watch good music, we listen to music or a dance performance. But a surefire way to achieve this sense of forgetting yourself, it seems to me, would be to visit temples and hug trees and put your wishes in little ribbons and say, God, I want a cradle like that one. Or this man in Ajmer, this is one of the cooks of Ajmer, this woman in Ambalapura temple who sits very quietly by herself. This woman in Parni who's a widow and makes her living from Muruga. And this woman in Nepal, for a moment I just watched her. She was putting the flowers, so quiet and peaceful. And my daughter in front of in the Ganga. And that's all I have. So to achieve transcendence, to forget yourself, to have a sense of community, to open your heart, to connect to the spirit. All this I find is a good way to achieve, is to go by going on a tirtha. And I would like to invite Sri on the stage too. And while Sri is coming up, I also wanted to add that I have seen not just transcendence, but also ecstasy, because a lot of the people, we live in a very passionless world. The daily life, I mean, we live with to-do lists and chores. But that Muruga temple lady who was circling the temple and screaming at the top of her voice, they are able to access and use their emotions to call out to a God who they aren't even sure exists, as we are. But the strength of belief creates this connection between the cosmos and their daily life. And I was envious, frankly, when I saw that, because I said, how will I achieve that? And so in the book, I ask my mother and she gives me an answer.
Good evening, everybody. And Shobha, that was a great presentation. And I'm sure many of you have some questions after seeing the presentation. If you've read the book, you have even more questions. I had a few questions on what made you write this book, but I think you've explained that. The other thing that I would like to start out by saying is, I congratulate you for several things. One is that you had the intellectual courage to write in the first person, to examine yourself, to expose your vulnerabilities, to expose your non-belief, or whatever is the word. And then you take us through this intellectual journey. And to me, the book appealed because it was not a tome, it was not something where you had first chapter is about the basics, the second is how it evolved, the third is the history, the whole thing of the chronological order, or explaining what is mythology, what is history, and you take. It appealed to me because you dealt with it in chunks, manageable segments of the different shrines and of different places. And you intersperse the chapters with everything you would have said perhaps in a comprehensive tome of 500 pages, but you brought it down to 270. So you interspersed it with your own opinions, your own viewpoints, your beliefs, and your doubts. So somewhere in the middle of the book, you are able to, at least I was able to identify with your thoughts and your misgivings. And yet at the same time, you're grounded in your childhood. They're grounded in what you call the rituals or the software to communicate with God. I think you say that somewhere in your book. So there comes this whole question of dissonance. You know, my background is psychology, but that was long, long ago. Yet, so when you have this cognitive dissonance, you have to work it out. There are several ways in which one comes to terms with this conflict, and you struggle with that right up to the end of the book. Do I say go whole hog, which you do surrender when you jump into the Ganga, whether you shut your nostrils and jumped in. You do surrender, which to me, when you speak about female energy, the Dakini, when you bow down to touch the feet of, that to me was a surprise. And before I have a few questions to you, but if you'd like to say something now.
No, Sri, please stop. Please stop.
And let me just go back to so that I don't skip my notes. You know.
No, in fact, in the run up to this.
Because the whole question of food and how you wove the food into this journey. You know, I mean, I think that gave us an interesting part of the book. And I was thinking that maybe the food element came in because of the arduousness that people had to go through, the hills they had to climb, and they had to walk to the shrines, and the necessity of feeding people got the term prasada. So one, of course, you're in a temple and you offer, whether or even at homes. I mean, there are many people, you fold your hands before you eat, or you say grace if you're in a Christian home, and you have this thing of offering to that invisible. No, I mean, way back in the 60s when I was doing my PhD, and a 21-year-old trying to struggle with Freud. And the course, I mean, it had 6 credits, and that course was Freud. And Freud's The Mind of a Moralist, written by Philip Rieff. I still remember where this whole question, Freud being an atheist, since you mentioned that, I wanted to bring it up. And towards the end of his life, because he was, his religion was Judaism, he was a Jew. Towards the end of his life, he writes about this whole question of how do I communicate with the invisible? That power. And he kind of gives in without giving in. I mean, knowing Freud, there is that moment of surrender. So it's important to us that the atheists and all these disbeliefs, all of us have been through those epiphany moments. You know, you come back inspired. What is that energy that you talk about in the book? The positive energy. How does it rejuvenate you? Is it the fact that you walked up the hill on an empty stomach, and then you went around the temple, waited for the puja to over? Or what is it that really, and this is where I think you have kind of a sum total of all these different shrines. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit on which part, the food and the faith part. And to me, your travelogue on Kashi was my favorite. I'm sure you have your favorites too. So please, go ahead.
I could keep on hearing you talk, but about the Kashi was my favorite too. It was a long chapter, but every chapter I end with a takeaway. And so, for example, in Udupi, they do this Chaturmasya Vrata, where they give up certain foods for certain months. And now we call it detoxifying, where we say give up certain foods. So after Udupi, I decided that, you know, we have this Ekadashi Vrat where we fast and stuff. So that was the takeaway. In Ajmer, Sufism is an amazing faith where, you know, the whirling dervishes that I have seen, essentially it's about the one hand up and one hand down to the earth. And it is an interiorization and internalization of Islam. And it includes song and dance. And the Sufis want to be one with the beloved. They called him beloved, not God. So that was a good takeaway. Kashi's takeaway was, the idea, the vision of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa on the river Ganga, looking at the Manikarnika Ghat where people are having the funeral, and he visualizes Shiva going and whispering the Taraka mantra in their ears, and then he goes into a trance. So like this, Shri, that every chapter, and the Langar, of course, was entirely about discovering that the man who is washing the dishes is a millionaire, and they have subsumed their ego, at least for that time, to come and serve their God. So every chapter I end with a takeaway, and I'm delighted you liked Kashi.
Yeah, the other question I'm sure that some of our viewers and people over here would have for you is, you avoided those that have been covered quite a bit, Tirupati and Srirangam, Guruvayur, all these temples which are, and you chose these temples. Could you tell us a bit on why these shrines and not others?
So the saying we have, the God has to call you. I went to Madurai to write about Madurai Meenakshi. I said she must have some prasadam, and she's a female goddess, let me go. As it turns out, the man there told me, go to this Aragar temple, the Dosai is worth dying for. I'd never heard of this temple. So in some senses, the God called me. I wanted to include a Jain temple, but I was not able to go time and time again. So the choice of a temple is exactly what you said, Sri, is that don't choose the really famous ones, and then choose ones that I was called to. Yeah.
And what intrigued me was, Shobha, how you bring in, and I think you mentioned a little bit, but you were rushed for time, the dance, the music, the art as a vehicle for you to communicate, or I think what is it called? In communion. In communion with God. And you mentioned that in several of your chapters. Would you like to tell us a bit, starting with Kathakali, I mean, all these different forms that you mentioned, and what your impressions were on the role? Because one thing for sure is, in the country, I mean, as vast as we are, and despite all the invasions and everything that has happened, we still, all our dance forms and almost all the music, as well as art, is, and the same thing in the West, is related to Ramayana, Mahabharata, the story of the Bible, the story of the creation, story of Christ. So there is something there that we cannot miss. So in your understanding, how, to what extent is that again a way of being in communion with the power? Yeah.
I think dance is a fantastic way to transcend yourself, and not dance as a performance, but dance as a way to forget yourself. I live in a Tamilian house, and one of the things that saddens me is our rituals now are reduced to just chanting and certain traditions. Whereas I went to Jagannath Puri and I saw photos of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, or I went to the Govind Dev Ji temple in Jaipur. Movement is part of their worship. And I think in South India, somehow we have missed that. So I think if we somehow incorporated this movement and magic, it will be easier to transmit our faith, no matter what faith you are, to the next generation, because the joy has somehow gone, the joy that was there, the bliss that you see in photos of these saints, the bliss that I saw in the Kumbh Mela, when all the Naga Babas run down to take the dip, and how delighted they are, that has just gone. Because now then we become into this whole, am I doing the right ritual? Am I keeping the right amount of prasada? All that. So the do's and don'ts have taken over the joy.
Yeah, but then you also use the word sanitized somewhere during your presentation.
Yes.
And, was it today and yesterday was the Tyagaraja festival. And there you see the devotion, people coming, sitting in groups, and despite COVID, with mask, without mask, whatever. And you have these devotees Well, of course, most of them are accomplished musicians.
Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't be able to sing there, but you can, I think. You're a musician. That whole, maybe the saints, maybe people like Tyagaraja, Purandar Dasa, they sublimated what, again, I'm using Freud, what we had as our feelings and as emotions. Because you make that distinction in your book in several places. I mean, I've marked it too. In what is faith, it's not something that can be thought, reasoned out. I think you use the word reasoning. You don't say irrational, but you say it's something that you cannot reason out. But then it gives way to feeling. It gives way to emotion. And in your takeaways, I think there's every chapter of your takeaway has a bit of this, and you bring it, you kind of build it up throughout, and you introduce other topics. Like when you talk about Amritsar, you're talking about peace, you're talking about community, and then does that faith come through the community working together, as you also mentioned in your presentation. So would you like to speak a little bit about that, how you make the distinction, and how long did it take you? I mean, were you taking these notes and were those chapters written after Kashi? Did you do it before you went to the next place, or did you come home and sit down and do it all together, please? Yeah.
So the answer is yes, I can. And I want to tell you today something that is not in the book, Sri. So there's a professor of religious studies in Harvard. Her name is Kimberly Patton. And I interviewed her for this book because I was very keen on including Christianity, but in an authentic way. The idea of prasadams, do they have it, don't they have it? Because in Bangalore, as you know, we have the Feast of St. Mary. So I interviewed her, and she described an event which is somewhat like what Sri said. She said, I visited Mount Tabor in Israel, where Jesus became the God, became the Son of God. And I witnessed a ritual that gave me goosebumps. And this is a full group of devotees who spend the 4 hours listening to the Greek Orthodox Christian chanting. Then they go out to the Sea of Galilee, and some Russian nuns will start shrieking like how the Gregorian chants happen. And then a cloud of light almost will rise up. And I went in thinking that's not going to happen. They say it happens every year, and it certainly did. And that reminded me of what in Kerala we call Makara Velakku, or in Tiruvannamalai the Deepam, which sort of self-reveals itself. And then all these devotees go back into the church, that cathedral on top of Mount Tabor. They spend the night and they incubate their dreams. That was the term she used. And what she meant was, again, with your Freud, they seek divine inspiration. They look for a sign. They look for God to come in their dreams too. And the Dalai Lama, when I interviewed him, said the same thing. He said, I said, when did you decide to go to Dharamshala? He said, I used many techniques, including divination, to decide when I would leave. And so magic and myth are tied, and mostly to the heart. And by being cerebral, we cut off ourselves from all of that. And I think to be in touch with faith is a way to access that creative, imaginative part of yourself. Because now, as after that Elizabeth Gilbert TED talk, we know genius comes to you. They're the daimon. That's what the Greeks called it. The daimon is a genius which comes from outside into you, and you are the vessel. So if you want to access that creative imagination, faith is as good a way as any.
And then you also have this whole question of ethos, the whole thing of ethnographic studies. And again, for some reason, we're becoming psychoanalysts here. The unconscious of Jung, and then again, Durkheim, and all these people, when they're looking at what is your heritage, your legacy, and how much of that is imbued from the day you're born, or to that extent, perhaps even before you're born, I'm not so sure. And that comes with the preservation. And you mentioned how the Chinese Revolution, unfortunately, people were not allowed to perpetuate their
I mean, they have as many fantastic traditions.
exactly their traditions, no? And whereas here, there are two things when you mentioned India, and because we have had several attacks. I mean, I don't need to go through the history, but there was preservation. And the preservation sustained despite whatever. I mean, you mentioned in the book about Kashi, how Aurangzeb did away with Bindu Madhava temple, correct, right? And yet, you still had the devotees over there, and Kashi continued to be Kashi despite that. And this you find even when in modern times, when you have people who are refugees and they are in their camps, and you go and you see the refugees wanting to hold on to their identity. Because that, I think, is something that comes out to every individual. You have lost everything, but I'm not going to lose where I'm from or who I am. And those things, I think, also sustain this thing of faith. And you bring it out several times in your book, but the physical aspects of it, the rituals, and the practices, the traditions, the anthropologists would call it the mores, of how we transmit knowingly and unknowingly. Some of the stories that you tell us in the book about your mother and your mother-in-law, small practices which you took for granted. Most of us here, I mean, we take it for granted. And then at a certain point, you say, hey, why am I doing this? Is it because my mother did it, or whether do I believe in it? And so passing on and transmitting. Yeah, go ahead, please.
But Shri, I think you and I are similar in that I believe that religious identity is one part, but I don't think it can be the main part. And with your permission, I'd like to read a section from the book where I make this stand quite clear. When I began this journey, it seemed like a fairly simple, obvious exercise. Travel to temples, eat good food, and make your peace with faith. Repeat. What I hadn't bargained for was how my faith would touch me and the questions it would raise and answer. Hinduism is a vast, magnificent religion, deep and mysterious, compassionate and complex. The pilgrimages introduced me to my faith. Religion is an inheritance and a choice. I was born a Hindu, but being a proud Hindu is something I wriggle away from. In Goa, a Hindu member of parliament told me that he was a proud Hindu within the confines of his home, but outside he was an Indian first and a Hindu last. That sounds about right to me. I think that in today's world, the religious identity is something I do not embrace. I think that in a land like India, where so many faiths jostle with each other, to do that is dangerous. We may pray to Jesus as Rama or Allah, but at the end of the day, we are all children of gods. We have many identities, but so yes, I'm a Hindu. I like my faith, but please, that's not all I am. That's how I ended. And so
yeah, you stole my pages. Anyway, before I ask you the next point, how much time do we have, Raghu?
5 more minutes.
Anybody keeping time? We're okay? Okay.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
One thing that when one goes through your book is sometimes you're whimsical, fanciful analogies. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, and the last person you would expect an analogy of Harry Potter is with Krishna. And then you say, hey, what's she saying? And then bang comes the profound statement of why you think. Or she opens a chapter on Palani, with walking into Carnegie Hall. So so the audience, to your book, I know you want to keep it international. And like we spoke the other day, if you're thinking of translations, you may want to look at Chota Bheem stories or that something Hanuman series that is there to bring in the, you wanted to soften and make it readable. But my other question that I had is when you describe Mathura, you do divert a little bit in saying, why is Rama adored much more than Krishna, or the other way around? So would you like to tell us about that? Because you have a reason for that.
Yeah, I think it depends on the kind of person you are. I think that I went into this book thinking that Rama is too perfect for me. He's not a flawed enough character for me to relate to. But they say that when a certain temperament is drawn to a certain god, and Krishna is for the people who have foibles and flaws, and Rama is for those who aspire to be better than they are. I also asked the question whether the Ganga would be better served if she had been thought of as a son, Indians protect their sons, whereas the mother Ganga is taken for granted and we throw whatever we like into it. So I asked the question, would the Ganga have been better served if she had been imagined by whoever imagined her as a river, as a child, a son, to be cared for, instead of a mother who you can take for granted. So I've been asked to summarize it for the Zoom, the audience.
For the Zoom audience. Yeah.
Basically what she says was
and the others over
Indians
here too.
have a capacity to do the sacred and the profane, the concrete and the abstract, and that Indians have a connection to the mother in a way that the father does not feature in the imagination. Yeah. Yeah. All rivers are, yes. Yeah.
Just repeat what you said at last.
It varies from region to region. In Bengal, they are obsessed with the Ma image. Yeah. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the thing with also what you raise in your book as well. This whole question of the different stories about Ganga. The origin and how the Ganga is sustained, and Shiva holding up the Bhagirath. All, I mean, they're extremely interesting, and how this whole question of the mother, the rivers are always mentioned considered to be feminine, and the whole thing of the mother, the nurturant. And to that extent, I think you have all the shrines are on the lakes and tanks and rivers and stuff like that. So before we open up for questions, there was just one other aspect of faith, not so much food, but this whole question of eroticism. And you mention it also in Ajmer, and then we see it in all the temple architecture, the art, and how do they live together? You touch upon it briefly in your book, but not to the extent. And of course, you bring in the tantric and much more in that when you speak about the Kumbh Mela, I think.
No,
so
but
would
Sri,
you like to spend a little time on that? Yeah.
I find that.
Did you come across that?
Yeah.
Well, how did you deal with it?
Yeah. I dealt with it in this way. I think it's a much more holistic way to live. And to use your phrase, Sri, from the world of psychology, is to make peace with your shadow, the shadow element that Freud said we all suppress. And so I think ancient India and most ancient cultures, whether it's Egypt or whether it is Iran, they had a way of handling all aspects of our life, including the sensual, in a way that somehow now we have all become prudes and disdain it or separate it. It wasn't that way. So as you say in is the person responsible for this separation is Queen Victoria, she says.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Yeah, we were not. Yeah. Yeah.
the other aspect that, oh, sorry.
Yeah. But I don't know if there are other questions from the audience.
Yeah, the other aspect was nature.
Yeah.
Hugging the tree. Remember,
Yeah.
you're touching the earth.
Yeah.
And you have a very good line in the book. The grain of sand,
Seeing the universe in a grain of sand.
grain of sand becoming the rock of God. So my last question to you is, when you say that your identity is determined by your work, I want to change that question and say, the same way as you have inherited, imbibed your legacy from your, you mentioned a lot about your grandparents and then your parents and then your, later your mother-in-law. And what do you see as leaving behind as a legacy for your children?
That's a great question. I hope that I can allow them to choose whatever faith they want. And I hope I can pass on to them that having a faith, no matter what it is a useful thing, because study after study has shown that the faithful lead better lives. They have higher immune systems. They are grounded in community. They have better relationships. So it doesn't matter if you choose Allah or Christ or the Parsi faith or Hinduism. I think if the next generation would consider faith as being part of their lives, that would be good. And specifically in Hinduism, I would like to pass on the joy that we once had, the dancing and the music and the drumming. I mean, if you look at it, the Trishur Puram, where the Chenda drums make this noise, is like a discotheque.
Exactly.
You go there and it's a trance-inducing experience. Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I would like to bring that back. Correct. What would you like to pass on?
Well, I would like to pass on simple practice of lighting a lamp. Lighting a lamp in order to awaken your mind. Lighting a lamp is an offering, which is, it need not be every day. It depends when you but doing it with the intention of, and whatever is there in front of you is the offering. That this was something that one needs to be thankful for. It's your own making. Most of the time, what you're thanking for is what you have worked for.
Yeah.
And so this is something, it's more like you said, choose a faith, but then recognize that it's possible to concretize it, or
and
have
live
what you say, coding your faith in behaviors.
And to live enriching, creative, useful lives because of it.
And you need the solace of at least that 1 minute of silence when you're lighting, which you speak about a lot in your book.
The pause,
Okay, now we're ready for questions if there are any.
We've set up a mic next to the door. You can see if anyone has questions, you can walk up to the mic and ask your questions. In the meanwhile, we have 2 questions from our attendees on Zoom. I'm going to take Banu Ramaswamy's question first. Are there any churches in India that offer food as an offering after a sermon, a rub-off perhaps from Hindu rituals? I'm not aware of any, but if there's any example, she wonders.
I also couldn't find any without massaging it to suit the book, so that's why I left it out.
Ma'am, can you give ma'am the mic so that everybody else?
No, but she was just commenting on the question.
Your comments, if you could.
I was just saying that they make it symbolic, the flesh and the blood of Christ, bread and the wine.
Yeah.
But feeding, and I don't think
Yeah.
They do a poor feeding which has nothing to do with the church.
Yeah.
They do it as a charity.
Correct.
But they don't, their faith is not infused with that.
Yes.
That's it.
Okay, we have the next question from Vanita Rajeshwar, who asks for a suggestion. Is there a simple but meaningful way to introduce our younger generation to our wonderful religions?
I believe I've answered that. I'm
There's anything else you want to
give
add?
I'll repeat what my daughter keeps saying, which is to find moments of joy in the faith. And I think eat lots of good food with the prasadams,
My take on that would be ask questions.
which I do.
I think it's that this whole book is about asking questions. And, growing up, especially when it comes to, you keep saying, why are we doing this? A 5-year-old, there's so many of these rituals. And the answer would be, you won't understand, so I'm not going to tell you. And, I suspect maybe the adult doesn't know either. And this is something that how many of us have really tried to stop and say, yes, my grandmother was doing it, my mother was doing it, I am doing it, but why am I doing it? And this will only strengthen your faith, because you're solving it for yourself. And this is what Shobha does in her book. She has this conflict and she tries to solve it for herself at her own level in order to seek the answers. And this is exactly what I think will strengthen faith. And she herself said how it has strengthened her.
Can I add about the Jewish chapter that you mentioned earlier? So one of the chapters is about the Bene Israel Jews of Mumbai. And one of the things I speak about in the chapter is how the son is involved in the Passover feast and he reads the Torah. So language is a problem for Hinduism because much of our rituals and much of the chanting and the transmission is in Sanskrit. And so a lot of it is not understood, like Sri said, not by us, and certainly difficult to pass on. Whereas in the Passover dinner that I experienced in Mumbai, the son was of Yael and Ralphie Girard. They are Bene Israel Jews who've lived in India for generations. And as they said, India is the only place where the Jews were made to feel welcome. The legend has it that they were washed on the Konkan coast and they became oil pressers, and they were called Shanivari Telis, people who took Saturday off. And then sort of a God-man comes and he notices how they use the fish. They eat the head of the fish like the Jews do. So when he asked them, which part of the fish do you use? The women pointed to the head, and then he said, okay, these are Jews who have been washed on shore in India. And there are lots of connections in that chapter that I make between, one suggestion was that the Chitpavan Brahmins and the Jews are linked. Of course, everybody has their own take on it. But the takeaway from the chapter was how they involved the son and made him run the show, which we really don't in most other faiths, whatever it may be. So giving the children the prime of the authority to conduct the ceremonies is a great thing.
Any questions from the audience? Yeah, we'll take a questions from an audience member before we go to a question from Zoom.
Yeah. Can you ask the question?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, ma'am. I had a question on knowing more about the culinary.
The mic a little bit, please. Or perhaps take your mask off for a minute.
Is this better? Okay. I was curious to know about the culinary traditions of the kitchens in some of these places of worship. And who are the gatekeepers of some of these culinary traditions, and does caste or gender have a role to play there?
yes, the caste and gender both have a role to play, and I had a problem with that. And I talk about it extensively in the book. The gatekeepers of the culinary. But that said, there are ways, if you would like to participate in the cooking of in the kitchens, that like that old man, there is a way for you to participate, because on the one hand, there are all these rules about certain castes doing certain jobs. But on the other hand, there are, in Hinduism, certainly there were loopholes by which you could. So you can, there are women outside the Udupi temple who will do the Tulsi Mala for the god. They will participate, they will somehow do it. But that said, the petty hypocrisies and all of it bothered me about.
I just want to ask, if you go to any temple or any matha in South, for that matter, even one of the photographs, we saw that the entire cooking is done by burning wood fire. That's because that's the only way it meets the muddy criteria. Kind of stuff. My daughter, of course, was horrified when she saw the wood, in one of the temples in Bangalore. Do you think it will change over a period of time and we'll start using something more friendly, let's say gas? And do you think that will change the entire taste of what is being prepared for the last few centuries?
That's a good question. I have, so the claim from the people, and I asked this question too, the claim is that for all the wood we cut, we keep planting more. So the claim is we are replacing, but I agree with you that I think at some point it'll be nice to use gas stoves or electric fire to use. They say that this will dilute tradition. So that too is a valid claim, unfortunately. So I am in two minds about this. I think that some traditions need to go. The question is who decides and which will go. Neither you or I have the authority to do that. And the Matha Adhikaris have made their peace by cutting down the trees, by ostensibly planting an equal number. So that's how they make their peace with it. I'm hoping that your daughter's generation, with the climate change and the environmental sensitivity, may influence the Matha Adhikaris to change that.
I think what we need here is a redefinition of what is pure. And this whole question of saying that firewood is purer than the gas that comes through the tubes.
But he made a point about
I'm saying that again, those things have not changed at all. I mean, that seems to be written in stone, and really it hasn't, there hasn't been that kind of rethinking or looking at it from
What about the taste, Sri? That's the other. What about the taste of the food? Do you think that will change if it's not cooked in wood?
Well, that again depends on what is defined as sattvic. You see, the whole question, the whole, it's like the unwritten rules. It's passed on. And whether it's Puri or whether it's Udupi or the other place that makes a dosa, the amount of ghee that is put into the payasam or the milk. And so these are those issues that, and then the sugar. Is it jaggery or is it sugar? So we are defined by what is pure and what is impure. And for some reason, it is sacrilege if you cross that boundary or you cross that line. And you really need another saint or some seer who to come in there and say, no, we can change, and we should make sure that we change. Perhaps the next generation.
We have a question from Zoom. Anushka Dev asks, how do you embark on a pilgrimage as a young woman in India?
Wow. Very carefully, very safely, and by figuring out, I think the way to do a pilgrimage in India is to figure out what you're after. What do you hope to get from it? If you hope to experience transcendence, as I did, then the choice of temples is easy, because but if you hope to find answers, there are specific temples, like the Chotanikara Bhagavati temple is a place to go if you want to understand about the sort of fierce female goddesses. So it depends on the question, depends on the quest. I think going on a pilgrimage is a quest, and you begin with the questions.
Let me also say, though, I mean, what Shobha has also said in the book, how it's just the fervor, the devotion, and the fervor with which people are jostling to get into that line. They would have traveled by bus, or they'd have traveled climbing up that hill because they couldn't afford the fees for the bus, I mean, the ticket. And they have really gone through a lot of arduous, tedious kind of, and fatigued. Now, that kind of a pilgrimage is very different to the pilgrimage, if I may, Shobha, say here, is where Shobha stays in a place where the Kumbh Mela in Haridwar, which has its own private bathing ghat into the Ganga. So, here again, who is that pilgrim? Who is it that stands for in Tirupati for 6 hours? Dharma Darshana. Instead of paying that 25, now it must be 100 rupees perhaps, and getting in for that favored darshana. And I think comes out in the book, and then she mentioned it in the presentation. This whole question of access.
Are we better pilgrims if we go in the Dharma Darshana? I think so.
No.
But
the access that the access is, you bribe the institution. I mean, or you buy a ticket to the institution.
I mentioned.
And then afterwards you curry favors with the purohit. Nange salpa munde bitpudi, ಒಂದು ನಿಮಿಷ ಅಷ್ಟೇ, that kind of thing. So when we are pilgrims, we have to think of a whole, somebody mentioned this question about gatekeepers. It's this whole question of the gatekeeper. And does the gatekeeper become your vehicle, your agent, for you to be in communion with the God or the deity that you want to see? Go ahead.
Madhu has a...
I was hesitating to ask a question because men coming and standing in front of the mic. Standing mics remind me of stage and saying padans before dancing. So, Shobha, I wanted to say, first of all, how proud I am of you. Every time you amaze us with this huge spectrum of topics, and within this book itself, from taste, transcendence to identity politics, so many areas you explored. So this is a part question, statement, and also request. And before that, I just remembered as you were talking, I remember how our mothers would bribe us, to take us to temples, Hanumanji ka bundi wala prasad, or Tirupati laddus, just came back. I was just wondering, as a dancer, I've always been fascinated about the concept of trance and how it is about a complete annihilation of the ego, like Chinnamasta cutting her head almost. And whether it's in a discotheque in Tokyo, and a dance studio in New York, a hippie festival, a shaman, or the whirling dervishes, they all talk about the same thing. And when you lose yourself, it's a moment of complete clarity. And you mentioned a little bit about that, about this priest when he cooks. So I was just wondering, cooking, so much about measure, texture, and in a world that's, sort of completely into getting Michelin stars, etc. I just wanted your take on this, on what is this concept of no ego while making prasad, or, and you spoke about the energy, right? That the person who cooks brings it day after day after day, because it's also routine. So I was wondering if there was a particular passage you'd like to read, because we love listening to you, or anything at all you'd like to say about that.
Thank you. So have you experienced trance when you dance?
Sometimes. I think it happens in the concept of what you call upaj, or improvisation sometimes. Because it also happens that we were having this conversation about muscle memory and somatic practice and the stacking up of body, mind, spirit, right? And when you're not bothered about who's watching you, which tal, which rag, but transcendence there also comes with iteration and riyaz, right? So that's a familiar area for me. And I don't know if I've had moments of trance on stage.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yes. In one Sharane piece I do, but it's probably in a more social,
Yeah.
informal space.
So this Rinpoche, the Buddhist teacher who I met, he said it this way, Madhu. He said that uh, as a seeker, your hope is that you soften the ego. He didn't say get rid of it. He said you soften the ego and you cajole it like a child to sort of go back to the womb in a way, and so that you can experience the divine. You can allow the divine to flow in, and perhaps in the kitchens that I saw. You go to a restaurant kitchen, it is the opposite of the chanting, and it is egos are flying, people are cursing, vessels are clanging. The food that comes out is delicious. So one question I have in the book is, do you need the intentionality that the cooks of so Nevedya becomes prasada after it is offered to the god. That is the cycle. So when you make the Nevedyam, it is food. But once it is touched by God, it becomes the gift of God. It becomes prasada. So that is the cycle. And the cooks, I think they are living what this Rinpoche talk about, which is that they are sublimating their ego, softening their ego, perhaps through chanting. And this article by Kimberly Patton, that Harvard professor I talked about, she says for this Russian nuns to sing and wail at the Sea of Galilee and have the cloud rise requires three things. One is it requires locality. Second, it requires intentionality. And third, then the epiphany will happen. So locality is Tirtha, is a pilgrim site, a temple or a mosque or a church, which has the energy, vibrations of generations of seekers. And somehow it imbues you with a certain mind frame. And I think the temple kitchens, what you talk about the trance, is generations. These are ancient temples, some are 1,000 years old. And the same thing has been happened. So you walk in and the energy changes if you are open to it. So that is locality. Intentionality is a desire, like that lady going around the temple, Anga Pradakshina. It is a severe intentionality or a sankalpam, as we call it. And then the epiphany you hope for. And sometimes it comes because it's a fickle God that many of us deal with, and we are fickle people. So that's.
Yeah. I think we're okay on time. Just the last few remarks. I think we had a lovely presentation by Yashoba, and there was one aspect that we did not cover, and perhaps I'm throwing out a challenge to you. What happens in our own homes? We all make the food and faith goes together. Janmashtami. I mean, there were times when you started out saying 21 khara, 21 sweet. Then now it's come down in my home to 3 khara and 3 sweet. Maybe this year 1 khara and 1 sweet. You cook the whole day. I mean, the whole question of it's food which you cook without fasting, which you offer.
With fasting, you mean.
I mean, I do it at least. And then you offer. And then after the puja, so the prasada. So several, whether it's Satyayana puja, whatever the puja, so these kinds of aspects, again, this means a different kind of research, and how much of it is preserved. And this is why I asked you, you mentioned about your family, and these are those small things that in my own way, I've tried to transmit to my daughter. And the little things, I mean, you make the modak during Ganesha or Janmashtami. Difficult, yet something. Okay, Amma, you said it, at least I'll make something and light the lamp and say whatever prayer I know. So that's passing on. But before we close, I just wanted to read something from Shobha's book, so that you know that how she has dealt with the dilemma of food and faith. This is in her conclusion. I think you read part of it, but I'll read when I began this journey, it seemed like a simple, fairly obvious exercise. Travel to temples, eat good food, make peace with your faith. Repeat. What I hadn't bargained for was how my faith would touch me, the questions it would raise and answer. Hinduism is a vast, magnificent religion, deep and mysterious, compassionate and complex. This pilgrimage reintroduced me to my faith and offered me beneficial practices that I adopted into my daily life. So thank you, Shobha, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sri.